Our cabin is in northern Minnesota, and during the winter, we heat the cabin with firewood that we harvest off our property. If you heat with firewood, or plan to in the future, you know that once you cut and split the wood, you need a place to store it. You need a woodshed. That's Sammy Ray, and I'm Jake. This is Big Forest Tiny Cabin. We moved onto this property in September of 2021. But we waited until the fall of 2023 to build our woodshed. The reason we waited was we didn't know how much firewood we would need to get through a winter season. What we found was that each year we were burning about 3 full cords, so we sized the woodshed to hold 4 cords. After considering our choices, we decided to build it with logs. Using logs meant more work, but the wood depot would be with us for a long time, and we liked the timeless look and classic style that log structures have. They're just a natural fit for off-grid life. But before we could begin construction, we needed a building site. There was an area along this lane that we liked. It was reasonably level, close to the house, and the lane would provide easy access for loading and unloading firewood. We decided to locate the woodshed here, so this spot needed to be cleared. We also needed logs. A lot of the trees on our land are what many people would consider small, but for this structure, they would be fine. We figured about 40 trees had to come down to get the proper diameter and lengths that we needed for the build, so we started felling trees. So once a tree was down, Sam limbed it, cut it to length, and removed all the brush. While she was doing that, I started dragging them out to be peeled. As the stack of peeled logs began to collect, we started grouping them according to diameter and length. The largest diameter logs were used for the structural posts and beams. These were 7 to 8 inches across. The build required various lengths, so most of them I cut as I went. The logs for the floor were 5 to 6 inch diameter, and I pre-cut them 8 foot long. I wasn't sure how many we would need. Turned out it was 24. And the 4 to 5 inch logs were used for rafters. I needed 13 for the roof, and those I cut to 11 foot 8 to leave a metal overhang of 2 inches on front and rear. We also needed 20 pieces 7 feet long cut from small stock to retain the firewood. These were 2 to 3 inches across, and we cut them from the treetops. Freshly peeled logs are prone to mold. This isn't much of a problem and can be washed off with a mild bleach solution. But I don't care to work on the ground, and making a table for them really isn't practical, seeing as how some of the logs are over 15 feet long. So I built some log horses that we used as workstations. This was our washing set. Depending on the length of the log, you just move them apart from each other the appropriate distance. The log can easily be rolled as you clean it, and you have room to move. And this is the set we use for oiling the logs. Same idea as the first set, except for small tables on the end to hold an oiling tray and a roller or brush. Sam took care of prepping the worksite. After the trees and brush were removed, she took out all the organic matter to get to bare ground and then put several inches of gravel down. After that, she set out the concrete footing pads and squared them up. The 4 corner posts were the first to be set up. I set each post in place one at a time as Sam stood back and eyeballed them for plumb. Then while I held the post, she secured it to stakes we had driven into the ground, or in one case a nearby tree. After the 4 corner posts were up and secured, I went back through them one at a time using a plumb bob to make small adjustments. The first horizontal logs I attached were the upper beams on each side, but I knew the small bumps and curves on the corner posts would require these connecting beams to be measured and fitted one at a time. After securing the beam with log screws, I put in a set of braces and then repeated this on the other side. Then I installed the lower side beams on each side. Pretty straightforward and easy to do. The next step was by far the hardest part of building the woodshed, putting the upper logs in place. These were big logs, and getting them up onto their posts was a job. These were 14 foot 8 inch and each weighed approximately 300 pounds. I started with the rear beam, and after centering it, I pinned it with 18-inch lengths of half-inch rebar. I then added the braces and moved on to the front. Getting that front beam up there took everything I had. I'm pretty sure that when I placed it on the post, the clouds parted, the heavens opened up, and I could hear angels singing. Not positive about that, though. I was a little lightheaded at that point. But I do know this for sure. I was really glad that part was done. Just like the rear upper beam, this log is also pinned to the post and then braced. I'm going to back up a little bit here and add a note. Putting bracing in can be challenging. Trying to hold the brace in place while making sure both ends are seated with one hand and then running log screws in with the other hand is almost funny to watch. Now you add in a ladder and it becomes a clown show. I found that using a ratchet strap to pull the brace into the corner worked well. Once the ratchet strap is on, I could use a club hammer to adjust and seat the brace, and then still have both ends free to run the log screws in. Another item that helped a lot while building this woodshed was the rack you see in this picture. Different from the log horses I showed earlier, this style works alone and is stronger and stiffer with a third leg on each end. Happens to have a small log on it in the picture, but easily held the 16-foot logs I was building with. I used this rack for peeling logs and making chainsaw cuts and notches. Alright, moving on. Just like I had done to the side walls, I wanted to add a lower beam to the rear wall. This would firm up the back of the structure and tie things together. Installing the rear lower beam was simple and straightforward. Just trim to fit and attach it to the posts. At this point I removed all the initial ground securement that we had used on the corner posts. Man, that was a sweet day. For weeks I had been working around all that with ladders, and while it was necessary to have, that bracing had really been in the way. Removing it opened up the worksite nicely. The front and rear floor beams went in next. They had been sitting for several weeks with rain and overcast days, and there was quite a bit of mold on them. This shot makes it easy to see how mold buildup on green logs can easily be removed. We were about halfway through cleaning these when the picture was taken. This old set of plastic shelves came in handy for storing and mixing the bleach and oil solutions. The floor for the firewood will rest directly on these large logs, and I don't know what 4 cords of wood weighs, but it's got to be a lot. So the floor support needed to be strong. The front log would be attached to the corner post with log screws to keep it in place, but I didn't want all that weight being held up by the log screws. So I notched a flat area on each end of the front log and rested that flat spot on the concrete pad. The flat notch and the log screws will keep the log from rolling or shifting, and all the weight will be on the pads. Because the front log was a single log, I wedged another concrete pad under the middle to ensure that the floor was well supported. The rear floor support consisted of 2 logs stacked one atop the other. To prevent these logs from slipping or rolling, I pinned them together with 3 lengths of 1/2-inch rebar, and they were both attached to the corner post with log screws. The bottom log had been notched to rest on the pads, so like the front, the weight rested on the pads. The reason for the second log was to compensate for the grade. The build site had been set up with a downward grade to the rear so water would drain away from the building and the lane in front of it. Accounting for this, I had cut the front post at 9'3" and the rear at 8 foot, hoping for a 412 roof pitch. But I had been guessing at those lengths. Turned out I was pretty close. As the build progressed, the log framework kept becoming more rigid, and at this point I felt I could get up on top to nail on the rafters. Placing and installing the rafters was quick and easy work. To get the amount of roof overhang that I wanted on the front and rear of the building, I measured and marked the outer rafters before I nailed them on. Then I ran a taut string at the top edge of the span from one end to the other to provide a guide for the rest. I nailed the third rafter down in the middle of the span and then just evenly spread in the remaining 10 and nailed them down. I had just finished the rafters and it began to rain. Not heavy rain, just enough to get you and all your tools wet. I had tarps at the cabin. I think everyone that lives off-grid keeps some around. And I started covering up so the logs wouldn't get soaked again. I was getting tired of scrubbing off mold. Once I got the roof on, that problem would go away. It takes a long time for green logs to dry, but once they're out of the rain, it's usually enough to stop the mold. The rain stopped the next day and I started on the strapping. I could have milled the strapping with my Alaskan mill, but I didn't want to take the extra time, so we purchased the 2x4s locally. The roof metal needed to overhang the strapping by 2 inches, so I used some old boards to set up guides, and then started with the top row and worked my way down. Anytime I came to spots on the rafters that stuck up too high, I surfaced that area. When I had a low spot, I put in a shim. Putting the first sheet of metal on the roof was a point I'd been looking forward to. It's probably something that anyone who's ever put up a building looks forward to. It meant the structure would soon be out of the rain, and after that, everything gets easier. Getting the roof metal on square meant first tacking it in place and then going up and down the ladder and around the building measuring the overhang. But once it's set and screwed down, the rest of the panels go on quickly. The metal roofing was available in 8-foot and 12-foot lengths, and 8-foot wouldn't have given me the overhang I wanted, so I bought 5 12-foot sections. I didn't want to cut the metal, so the roof was going to be a 12 by 15. Knowing that, and knowing I needed a capacity to hold 4 full cords is what determined the dimensions of the woodshed. After taking off the allowance for roof overhang, that left a building that would be an 8 by 12 at outside dimensions. Then taking away the thickness of the framing logs and the firewood retainers, I would be left with a floor that was about 7 foot deep by 10.5 feet across. I cut my firewood to 16-inch lengths, and the floor would hold 5 rows from front to back. If I wanted to store 4 cords, the rows would need to be stacked 7 feet tall. Well, I got all but the last sheet of metal onto the roof, and it started to rain again, so I pulled the tarp up and worked on the floor. Other than getting a little wet, the floor install was a simple job. The floor logs were already cut, so I put out a string line and laid them and nailed them one at a time, working across the floor. When the rain stopped, I pulled the tarps off and finished up the roof. Then I started the last step, adding vertical poles to hold the firewood. I had 20 of these pre-cut and waiting. I spaced them with 2 on the outside of each row, leaving space between rows for airflow. They were all cut at 7 feet, except for the front pair, which I trimmed to clear the bracing. And just like that, it was finished. It had taken about 8 weeks to build, but of course I wasn't working on it every day. When you're trying to start a homestead, there's always something else that needs to be done. Like fill the woodshed. To be honest, Sam did most of that. Up until this point, as we cut and split firewood, we had been piling and tarping it. One example is next to the woodshed. We had many of these on the property, and over the next couple weeks she kept hauling loads up here and stacking it in. Till it looked like this. Now that's a pretty sight. It's a good feeling knowing the cabin will be warm all winter. This was the first time I had built with logs, and I'm quite sure professional builders could have done better. But I did the best I could, and I think it came out pretty good. It's held up real well, and the only maintenance we do is to add another coat of oil each year. And as far as what it cost, we bought 7 concrete pads, 5 sheets of metal roofing, 14 2x4s, roofing screws, log screws, pole barn nails, 4-inch screws, 3.5-inch nails, chainsaw fuel, diesel, for a total of $493. So I think for what we paid and what we got, it's a great value. The logs made the woodshed rugged and sturdy, and it gave it a unique natural look that ties in well with our homestead lifestyle. As Sam finishes up here, I want to say thanks for joining us. My name's Jake, and you've been watching Big Forest Tiny Cabin. See you next time.